deception is possibly the second oldest maneuver in battle. As soon as man learned how to punch, he next learned how to feint and thus deceive his opponent about his intentions. From the moment the first human raised a stone against another, warfare has always been accompanied by a silent shadow, deception. Today, we're diving deep into the most audacious military deception operations in history, from the legendary Trojan horse to the brilliant maneuvers of World War II. The art of military deception has been practiced throughout history, but it's surprising that some of the most unusual deceptions performed in World War II have not only been ignored, but also seemingly forgotten by the army that originally developed them. The most famous example is the Trojan horse, but the ancient world is filled with other cases of tactical brilliance. When Hannibal had to cross some mountains, he sent a column down through a different pass than the one he planned to use. He tied torches to their horns so that at night they looked like a moving body of men. His enemy moved to defend that pass while Hannibal slipped through the mountains from another direction. The writings of Julius Caesar are filled with examples of deception. In his book, The Gallic Wars, Caesar instructed his men to build encampments smaller than normal to deceive the enemy about their true numbers. On another occasion, he instructed his men to appear to be tired and worn out, thus purposely drawing an enemy attack. During the American Revolution, the colonists made frequent use of deception to compensate for their weak numbers and lack of weapons. General Washington allowed phony documents to be captured, constructed decoy installations, and planted information with known enemy agents. Large quantities of supplies were purchased in specific locations to make the British think a colonial army was massing in that area. Carefully coached deserters fed the British false information on American plans. At the campaign outside Philadelphia, Washington made the British think his 3,000-man army was 40,000 strong. At Boston, he forced the British to withdraw under threat of bombardment from guns that were seriously short of ammunition. During the American Civil War, both sides realized they were able to read the other's semaphore signals. On at least a few occasions, false signals were sent, designed to be intercepted and read by the enemy. Before the 7 Days Battle in 1862, the South planted false information on a deserter sent over to the North. During the Antietam campaign later that year, General McClellan captured the vital Southern documents known as Special Order 191. These described Confederate plans in great detail, but they were not acted upon because the information was thought to be another ruse. At various times, both sides attempted to deceive the enemy with wooden dummy artillery known as Quaker cannon. During the First World War, camouflage developed into a high art. Dummy trenches and positions were constructed to fool aerial reconnaissance. Dummy soldiers were created to draw the fire of enemy snipers, thus allowing the snipers to be located. On the oceans, Q ships, resembling unarmed merchant ships, took a toll on German submarines when their hidden guns suddenly opened fire. The letter Q thus became a code for a decoy or dummy object. Dummy airstrips would later be known as Q strips, and false lighting arrangements as Q lights. One of the better-known deception operations in World War II took place in the Middle East. An intelligence officer appeared to drop a dispatch case containing phony maps and orders. The Turks, upon intercepting the messages indicating that the careless officer was to be court-martialed for losing the plans, decided that the documents were real and thus were misled about the real direction of a British attack. The story of deception in World War II has, until now, been largely that of strategic deception. The most commonly mentioned operation is Fortitude, the Allied plan to deceive the Germans about the location and date of the Allied landings in Normandy. Strategic deception involves attempting to fool the enemy on a grand scale. Tricking the Germans into thinking you will invade Norway or Greece when your real target is France is a strategic deception. Tactical deceptions concern events that take place in a more localized area, generally within the same country or within the boundaries of one army or army group. Tactical deceptions in World War II could involve divisional or regimental-sized units, but they could also involve units as large as an entire corps or down to the level of an individual battalion or company. Tactical and strategic deceptions also differ in the amount of time involved. Typically, a tactical deception operation will last for a few hours to, at the extreme, a few weeks. The key is to fool the local enemy commander into making a decision long enough to affect his battle plans. A strategic operation can take place over a matter of months or even years, the object being to compel the enemy into a decision that will in turn take a long time to reverse, such as placing troops in Norway rather than France. At some point, the lines between tactical and strategic deception become blurred, and many operations contain elements of both. Many deception operations have one name for the overall plan, then many different sub-schemes for each segment. Fortitude was actually part of Operation Bodyguard, the overall plan to conceal preparations for the invasion of France. Germany was involved sending a double of General Montgomery to Gibraltar to draw attention away from England. Operation Quicksilver covered the radio deception. Quicksilver II, the decoy landing craft. Quicksilver III concerned the display of dummy units preparing for D-Day. Quicksilver IV covered the radio deception, Quicksilver VI, the decoy landing craft, Quicksilver IX at the deceptive bombing campaigns, and Quicksilver in the decoy port lights along the southern coast. Operations Trolley Car and Twelfth dealt with the movements of both imaginary and genuine formations in the UK. No history of deception in World War II would be complete without mentioning the work of British magician Jasper Maskelyne. He claimed credit for advancing deception by bringing the practice of stage magic to military. The British emphasis on deception, however, started well before him in the North African desert when General Wavell came in touch with what France was. According to other memoirs of the period, Maskelyne's contribution to deception was in itself a deception. His principal function in the British Army was developing materials for M19 to help Allied POWs escape into British hands, as well as lecturing on escape and evasion.
A popular and semi-fictional account of Maskelyne's wartime effort gives him far greater credit for deception than he deserves. His main contribution to deception was that many British officers increased their faith in the field of deception operations only because the well-known, semi-miraculous Maskelyne was supposedly involved in it. The first British deception unit, A-Force, was organized in 1940 under the command of Brigadier Dudley Clark. Outnumbered and outgunned, the British were desperate to find a way to make their small forces appear more numerous and powerful. The desert is a perfect environment for deception. With so few obstructions, decoy vehicles and dummy installations can be seen for a great distance. A-Force created perfect phony British tanks, also constructed covers for genuine tanks that made them appear to be trucks. These covers were known as sun shields. A-Force's Operation Bertram was a surprisingly successful attempt to mask General Montgomery's planned buildup before the Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. It involved many different forms of deception, including not only decoy tanks, but also dummy pipelines and supply dumps. When Montgomery attacked on July 23rd, the Germans were taken completely by surprise, having assumed his attack would come from a different location sometime in November. One of the more unusual tricks performed in the desert was to disguise captured German munitions, then place false notes in them claiming it was the work of anti-German resistance workers in the munitions factories. The munitions were carefully returned to German lines in hopes that German soldiers would suffer a loss of morale after finding their own supplies had been sabotaged at home. Carefully crafted rumors were disseminated about these sabotaged munitions, and even today it is accepted as fact by many that infected laborers in Germany took the risk of not only sabotaging equipment, but of including notes indicating they had done so. To coordinate the various deception operations underway around the world, the British formed the London Controlling Section. The LCS pressed to have the ICS be allowed to govern operations for all the Allies, but the Americans developed their own approach to deception. Formed in August 1942, it was initially known as the Joint Security Committee, but the name was later changed to Joint Security Control, or JSC. The duty of the JSC was twofold: preventing information of military value from falling into the hands of the enemy, and timing the implementation of those portions of cover and deception plans that had to be performed by military and non-military agencies in the United States. The JSC was composed of 3 general officers, one each from the Army, Air Force, and Navy, each with a colonel or Navy captain as his assistant. They were allowed to organize their own staff of enlisted men as felt necessary. Sadly, many of the records of the JSC dealing with deception do not seem to be included in the National Archives, and some indicate they may be in the hands of the CIA. The British were convinced that they should remain the supreme authority on deception, and made a few attempts to bring the JSC underneath their command. At the end of 1943, the British released a report claiming that American deception was poorly organized, whereas the British had everything running smoothly. The ploy did not work. Along with the Americans, the British deception headquarters remained separate entities. They did agree to work closely together. There were many Allied strategic deceptions during WWII, mostly run by the British, and far more than can be mentioned in this book. A number were used to divert attention from Operation Torch, the 1942 invasion of North Africa. Operation Kennicott pointed to a landing in Greece. Operation Solo indicated Norway was the target, and Operation Overthrow pointed to an invasion of France. The Americans ran Operation Sweater, which claimed their troops, actually destined for Africa, were merely being sent to train in Haiti. Operation Cockade included plans to make the Germans think there were 570,000 Americans in England by August 1943, when in fact there were only 100,000. It also indicated a planned landing in 1943 of British troops in Normandy, in Norway, and of American troops in Britain. To demonstrate that the Americans were interested in the Brittany region, Operation Pound had the 29th Ranger Battalion raid an island near the port of Brest, with specific instructions to leave American equipment for the Germans to find. Almost every soldier in WWII can recall a time when rumors of his unit shipping out to a cold or warm climate were suddenly found to be false. Special clothing, supposedly to be used in a cold environment, was taken back, and the unit sailed instead for the tropics. Phrase books in Japanese were distributed to troops, who instead of heading to the Pacific went, of course, as veterans will also attest. Some of these may have been true military blunders, but the majority were parts of schemes to confuse the enemy as to the final destination of the unit in question. One of the more unusual tricks performed in the desert was to disguise captured German munitions, then place false notes in them claiming it was the work of anti-German resistance workers in the munitions factories. The munitions were carefully returned to German lines in hopes that German soldiers would suffer a loss of morale after finding their own supplies had been sabotaged at home. Carefully crafted rumors were disseminated about these sabotaged munitions, and even today it is accepted as fact by many that infected laborers in Germany took the risk of not only sabotaging equipment, but of including notes indicating they had done so. To coordinate the various deception operations underway around the world, the British formed the London Controlling Section. The LCS pressed to have the ICS be allowed to govern operations for all the Allies, but the Americans developed their own approach to deception. Formed in August 1942, it was initially known as the Joint Security Committee, but the name was later changed to Joint Security Control, or JSC. The duty of the JSC was twofold: preventing information of military value from falling into the hands of the enemy, and timing the implementation of those portions of cover and deception plans that had to be performed by military and non-military agencies in the United States. The JSC was composed of 3 general officers, one each from the Army,
Air Force, and Navy, each with a colonel or Navy captain as his assistant. They were allowed to organize their own staff of enlisted men as felt necessary. Sadly, many of the records of the JSC dealing with deception do not seem to be included in the National Archives, and some indicate they may be in the hands of the CIA. The British were convinced that they should remain the supreme authority on deception, and made a few attempts to bring the JSC underneath their command. At the end of 1943, the British released a report claiming that American deception was poorly organized, whereas the British had everything running smoothly. The ploy did not work. Along with the Americans, the British deception headquarters remained separate entities. They did agree to work closely together. There were many Allied strategic deceptions during WWII, mostly run by the British, and far more than can be mentioned in this book. A number were used to divert attention from Operation Torch, the 1942 invasion of North Africa. Operation Kennicott pointed to a landing in Greece. Operation Solo indicated Norway was the target, and Operation Overthrow pointed to an invasion of France. The Americans ran Operation Sweater, which claimed their troops, actually destined for Africa, were merely being sent to train in Haiti. Operation Cockade included plans to make the Germans think there were 570,000 Americans in England by August 1943, when in fact there were only 100,000. It also indicated a planned landing in 1943 of British troops in Normandy, in Norway, and of American troops in Britain. To demonstrate that the Americans were interested in the Brittany region, Operation Pound had the 29th Ranger Battalion raid an island near the port of Brest, with specific instructions to leave American equipment for the Germans to find. Almost every soldier in WWII can recall a time when rumors of his unit shipping out to a cold or warm climate were suddenly found to be false. Special clothing, supposedly to be used in a cold environment, was taken back, and the unit sailed instead for the tropics. Phrase books in Japanese were distributed to troops who, instead of heading to the Pacific, went, of course, as veterans will also attest. Some of these may have been true military blunders, but the majority were parts of schemes to confuse the enemy as to the final destination of the unit in question. One of the more unusual tricks performed in the desert was to disguise captured German munitions, then place false notes in them claiming it was the work of anti-German resistance workers in the munitions factories. The munitions were carefully returned to German lines in hopes that German soldiers would suffer a loss of morale after finding their own supplies had been sabotaged at home. Carefully crafted rumors were disseminated about these sabotaged munitions, and even today it is accepted as fact by many that infected laborers in Germany took the risk of not only sabotaging equipment, but of including notes indicating they had done so. To coordinate the various deception operations underway around the world, the British formed the London Controlling Section. The LCS pressed to have the ICS be allowed to govern operations for all the Allies, but the Americans developed their own approach to deception. Formed in August 1942, it was initially known as the Joint Security Committee, but the name was later changed to Joint Security.
General Slim was able to make good use of tactical deception in his Burma campaign. Operation Cloak indicated his objective was Mandalay, while he was actually headed for another point 70 miles to the south. However, deception in the Pacific was not as successful as in Europe because the Japanese combat leaders paid little attention to their own intelligence branches. One deceptionist in the Pacific said, "We could get the Japs to swallow the most outrageous and implausible fabrications, but it had no operational effect on us." The Americans undertook a few deception operations in the Pacific. These mainly involved hiding the locations of naval or air forces. Operation Wedlock in 1944 created a fictional force in the Northeast Pacific that appeared ready to invade the Kuril Islands. This pinned down Japanese troops and equipment in an area where American had no intention of attacking. To encourage the Pacific commanders to use deception techniques, the JISC brought teams of 3 officers from each of the Army, Air, and Navy to the States for a month of training.
These teams were then sent back to the major Pacific commands to help spread the word about deception and encourage it. General MacArthur in the Central Pacific showed enthusiasm for deception and encouraged it. General MacArthur in the Southern Pacific did not welcome the outsiders to his command. His headquarters felt they already had a grasp of deception principles and required no outside assistance. Incidentally, the JISC team did leave developed plans for the invasion of Luzon. The third major command in the Pacific, the ABI, China, Burma, India, did not encourage the deception plans, but it was Slim's show. The region was shared with British forces who felt they had more experience in such matters and did not want to cooperate with the Americans until near the end of the war. To beef up British naval strength in the East, an old disarmed battleship, HMS Centurion, was visually modified to appear as the new and heavily armed HMS Anson and sent off to an Indian port. Much of this naval deception exaggerated the number of major ships in service or made vessels under construction appear to be operational by having them send out false radio messages. Operation I-Hook helped keep Japanese subs from patrolling the East African coast by portraying the aircraft carrier HMS Indefatigability cruising the area months before she had been finished. Near England, the Royal Navy was also able to manipulate the operational areas of the German submarine service with planned leaks about new anti-submarine weapons and phony minefields. The most important use of strategic deception in World War II was probably Operation Fortitude. This was the attempt to deceive the Germans as to the actual location and date of the main invasion of France. One of the key factors in this deception was that the British had managed to take control of most German agents in England. He turned spies then told German intelligence only what the British wanted them to hear, meaning whatever troops dispositions the British desired. It is generally thought that the British had captured or controlled all German agents in England. However, it is claimed that at least one, codenamed Druid, remained on the loose and continued to send correct reports to the Germans. Leaking information through turned enemy agents was known as sending the special means. The use of German turned agents to convey selected intelligence to the Wehrmacht was one of the more important aspects of strategic deception in World War II. German reconnaissance aircraft could spot a buildup of troops or a flotilla of landing craft, but when an agent on the ground corroborated the information, it simply had to be true. Although this concept of using turned spies to assist in deception operations is best known in conjunction with the XX Committee in England, it actually originated with Dudley Clark's A-Force in North Africa. The basis of Fortitude, normally overlooked by most historians, is that it was constructed on a bogus order of battle that began in 1943 with Clark. The Desert Clark realized that once a military intelligence agency identifies an enemy unit, it would go to great pains to try to figure out its exact location, assuming that established units just don't disappear. Once a unit is thought to exist, only the slightest shred of evidence is needed to convince the enemy as to its current location. Clark spent the early years of the war carefully building up the background of three dummy British armies, the 9th, 10th, and 12th. The Germans became convinced these were genuine units. When they disappeared from known locations, German intelligence became desperate to find where they had gone. A few small hints of a new location, especially where the Germans already directly they were likely to go, and the Germans would readily accept it. This bogus order of battle was built by taking a small organization, such as a regional administrative headquarters, training school, or supply depot, and renaming it a battalion, regiment, or brigade. Thus, the Meena Sa Area Command became the 23rd Indian Divisional Signals. Bogus unit insignias were used by this inflated unit until its false identity became known in the area. Shifting units and forming new ones helped build up the phony strength. When a unit was confirmed as a corps headquarters and a few officers in the area were found to be corps support elements, the enemy would find it easy to believe that the rest of the corps must be in the region.
The importance of a formation of a bogus order of battle cannot be understated. The turned German spies were important, but without these dummy units firmly established in the minds of the German military intelligence, Fortitude would have been much harder to pull off. Without a history, developed over a period of time, showing the Allies developed a greater number of units than they had, the Germans could not have been as surprised by the large number of units appearing at a previously ever northern front. The success of the war's most important strategic deception thus relied much on the earlier planning and groundwork laid down by Dudley Clark. Such other operations as Zeppelin would have been much harder to execute had the Germans thought a far greater Allied force existed than there really was, thanks to the First Army orders of battle.
Operation Fortitude still remains understudied by many historians. Only part of it was to mislead the Germans as to the location and time of the Normandy invasion. It did far more. For weeks after D-Day, Fortitude continued to pin down vitally needed German reinforcements at Calais by making the Germans think another, larger invasion was yet to come in that sector. Had the Germans realized the Normandy invasion was the main and thrown everything they had against it, they may well have been able to drive the Allies back into the sea. Although it is impossible to watch a documentary on D-Day without the obligatory shot of inflatable tanks and jeeps, few outside of the circles that such decoys were used in Fortitude. The British government has at last declassified the final report on the operation, in which they admit they used very few of the props. The only use Fortitude made of special equipment was in the employment of dummy landing craft. The only decoys mentioned in the plan were 60 inflatable landing craft, known as Big Bobs, dummy airstrips and aircraft, 56 aircraft with Q lights following along set up along the coast to simulate the nighttime loading of men into landing craft. Rubber dummies would not have been needed when the areas containing the bogus units already had massive amounts of equipment and vehicles ready to be shipped to France when needed. It may have been easier in the post-war era to credit the decoys rather than for the British to explain how they had successfully turned German agents. Other deception operations tied to the invasion of Normandy were Glimmer and Taxable. These were air and naval operations designed to fool German radar into thinking that major landings were taking place at other locations along the coast. With such operations, deception was entering the electronic age. Operation Titanic involved the dropping of small burlap dummy parachutists, codenamed Ruperts or Paragons, to confuse the Germans as to the locations of the actual landing zones. A handful of British paratroopers jumped amidst the dummies to play phonograph recordings of battle noises, while some of the dummies were rigged with small explosive devices to simulate gunfire. Titanic was scaled back at the last minute to only 2 drops, each with 2 parties of 5 genuine paratroopers and 500 dummies. But the story of these dummy paratroopers has taken on a life of its own. No mention of Fortitude would be complete without considering a new theory on the subject. There are some indications that the Abwehr, the German military intelligence agency, had a number of anti-Hitler officers within its ranks. Not only does it appear probable that the one-time head of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris, may have helped the Allies' war effort by providing them useful information, but it may have also distorted German intelligence reports in the Allies' favor. Canaris was dismissed from the Abwehr in February 1944 and executed in April 1945, but evidence has come to light that his work may have been carried on by others. Colonel Alexis von Rohn of the Abwehr sorted and evaluated all information coming into the agency regarding enemy armies and intentions in Western Europe. He had the key position when it came to issuing reports on what to expect from Allied forces based in England. There is good evidence that he had discovered the Fortitude deception, but reported the inflated troop numbers and locations opposite to Calais for an unknown reason. One possibility is that as a loyal but anti-Nazi German, he wanted the Allies to land in Europe, so they, not the Russians, would get to Berlin first. For whatever reason, he appears to have knowingly passed on the false estimates to his superiors. Von Rohn was eventually involved during the investigation of the assassination attempt against Hitler in July 1944. On 11 October, the colonel was hanged as a co-conspirator. There is a very good possibility that other men in the Abwehr actually saw through the Fortitude deception, but chose for political reasons to let it work from their end and let it pass upward. On 1 September 1944, a tremendous breach of security occurred when reporter Hanson Baldwin was able to publish a 2-column article in the New York Times mentioning the use of deception in the invasion of France. The members of the JSC were horrified, and the British were swift to complain. General A.T. Jones of the British Joint Staff Mission in Washington wrote a scathing letter to the JSC stating, "Even under the strictest of the European war, it will be undesirable to publish details of deception practiced by the Germans by the Allies." Once the Allies were firmly established in France, the time for strategic deception in Europe had ended. Then, tactical deception was needed to defeat the Germans in battle. Shortly after the Allies landed in Normandy, the first operation of the 23rd Special Troops took place. This unit took part in over 20 major operations. It also took part in a number of other less notable missions, many of which are hardly mentioned in the unit files. A propaganda broadcast at Saint-Malo and a detachment of dummy artillery sent to Cherbourg, for example, are only casually mentioned in the unit records. Following on the success of the 23rd in Northern Europe, a second sonic deception unit, the 3122nd Signal Service Company, was sent to help in Italy. It took part in only 2 operations before the war ended. With the collapse of Germany, plans were underway for the deception troops to be redeployed for the invasion of Japan. After all, these deception units had honed their techniques and had their usefulness in the Pacific battlefield. Men and equipment were sent to the Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp, New York. When word was received that VJ happened, however, the troops packed up their equipment, sent it off for storage, and went home. Before they left, they were told to not talk about their wartime activities for at least 60 years of complete silence. Some took this order to heart and took the secret to their graves. Others stayed in the Army and pressed for continued research into methods of military tactical deception. They were hampered by the fact that their wartime exploits were still classified, so they could not tell their commanders just how smart and effective tactical deception could be. But they had been part of an amazing unit that had consistently fooled the Germans during the war. Immediately after World War II, the threat of Soviet Russia was made extremely important to keep deception methods secret in case they someday needed to be used against this new enemy. There is a massive body of knowledge about World War II in Europe, a small amount on Allied strategic deception, but next to nothing on the tactical deceptions performed by special units under the very noses of the Germans. Some of the records have been declassified, the 50-year period of silence has come and gone, and the few remaining men of the deception units have started to come forward. There are only a handful of men from these remarkable units alive today, but one of their fondest wishes is that their story be told, not for their own glory, but because they know firsthand that battlefield deception can save lives.